He didn't plan to stop in this town. His truck ran out of gas, and the road refused to let him pass. They said Red Hollow was quiet and safe, yet everything here seemed afraid of the night. His dog suddenly blocked the road, growling at empty darkness, warning him of something no human could sense. That feeling returned, the same one he used to feel seconds before an ambush overseas. Then the voices began calling his name. Doors opened by themselves, and familiar faces appeared, twisted and wrong. He didn't fight with weapons, but with discipline, silence, faith, and trust in the dog who walked half a step ahead. If this story speaks to you, please like the video, subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts, and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers. The engine died without drama. No sputtering, no cough, no warning light flickering on the dashboard to soften the moment. 1 second the truck was moving, tires humming softly against the asphalt. The next it was coasting in silence, momentum bleeding away as if something unseen had reached out and gently taken hold. Caleb Rowan kept his hands on the wheel long after the truck rolled to a stop. He didn't slump. He didn't sigh. 40 years of habit kept his back straight, shoulders squared, posture calm even as fatigue settled deep into his muscles. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with a broad frame shaped by years of function over form. His shoulders were wide, his back thick, his chest solid without excess. Nothing about him was ornamental. Everything about him suggested endurance. The streetlight ahead flickered once, bathing the hood of the truck in weak amber light. Red Hollow. The town's name was stenciled onto a metal sign, leaning slightly to one side, paint cracked and flaking as if it had been scraped by decades of weather and neglect. Beyond it, the road vanished into darkness and trees. Behind Caleb, the same. No headlights, no sound, just the faint ticking of cooling metal under the hood, and the distant rustle of leaves stirred by a wind he couldn't quite feel. In the passenger seat, Orion lifted his head. The German Shepherd was large, fully grown, his body long and balanced, built for work rather than show. His coat lay thick and close against his frame, black along his back and shoulders, fading into deep tan at his chest, legs, and muzzle. He didn't move suddenly. He rose with quiet intention, paws braced against the floor, muscles tightening beneath his fur. His ears stood rigid, angled toward the tree line to the left of the road. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. There was nothing there. No sound, no movement, no animal calls or rustling branches, just forest, dense, ancient, and unnervingly still. Orion's fur began to lift along his spine, one slow ridge at a time, as if responding to something that existed just outside the range of human senses. That was when the feeling came. It slipped into Caleb's chest with practiced familiarity, settling behind his ribs like a held breath. He had felt it before, on foreign roads under darker skies, moments before the world erupted into violence. It wasn't fear. Fear was loud. This was quiet, precise. A subtle internal alignment that told him something was wrong before his mind could assemble the reason. He trusted that feeling. He trusted Orion more. Caleb stepped out of the truck, boots hitting the pavement with controlled weight. He was dressed as he always was now, an olive green combat shirt hugging his broad torso, sleeves covering arms that bore faint scars and sun-worn skin. The fabric stretched where it needed to, darkened slightly with sweat beneath the arms. Camouflage patterned the shoulders and sleeves, muted greens and browns blending into the night. A field watch rested against his left wrist, its dark metal casing scratched but intact, ticking steadily as if unaware that time had thickened around them. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, with something metallic underneath, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Across the street, a gas station glowed under fluorescent lights. A large sign above the pumps read 24 hours, the red letters faded and uneven. Caleb crossed the road and tried the door anyway, despite already knowing the answer. The lock held firm. Inside, shelves were neatly stocked, untouched, preserved in a way that suggested routine without use. No attendant, no movement. Orion remained near the truck, standing squarely, eyes never leaving the forest. Caleb turned toward the town. People were watching. They stood in doorways and beneath awnings, leaned against pickup trucks parked too close to the curb. Men and women of different ages, faces lined by years that looked heavier than they should have been. Their expressions weren't hostile. No one reached for anything. No one stepped forward. They looked afraid. Not of him, not of Orion, of the fact that he had stopped. Caleb felt their eyes follow him as he moved toward the diner at the corner of the street. The building was low and narrow, paint peeling around the windows, the sign buzzing faintly overhead. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and oil clung stubbornly to the air. An older man sat alone at the counter near the window. He was thin and stooped, his white hair sparse beneath a battered cap. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins standing out along hands that trembled slightly as they curled around a chipped mug. His eyes were sharp, despite his age, tracking Caleb's reflection in the glass before lifting to meet him directly. Behind the counter stood a woman in her mid-40s, tall and lean, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. Her face was angular, her mouth set in the line that suggested discipline rather than warmth. She paused mid-motion when she saw Orion step inside, her grip tightening briefly on the coffee pot before she set it down. No one spoke at first. Caleb took a seat near the door. Orion lay at his feet, body aligned toward the entrance, head up, ears forward. He was resting, but not relaxed. The old man leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that it barely rose above the hum of the lights. "If you're staying the night," he said, eyes fixed on Caleb's face, "don't go outside after midnight." Caleb held his gaze, reading the lines carved deep into the man's expression. This wasn't superstition. It wasn't theatrics. "And listen to your dog," the man added. There was no pause for effect, no explanation. Caleb nodded once. "Noted." The woman behind the counter finally spoke. "Rooms are upstairs," she said, voice tight, controlled. "Cash only." Caleb paid without comment. The room was small and spare, a narrow bed, a single chair, a window overlooking the main street. Beyond the last row of buildings, the forest loomed like a wall, dark and unyielding. Caleb set his bag down, movements economical, even in exhaustion. He removed his boots, placed them side by side, then checked the window. The streetlight outside flickered again, once, twice, before steadying. Orion stood near the door, unmoving. Caleb glanced at his watch. 11:47 p.m. He had not planned to stay. His intention had been simple. Sleep, fix the truck at dawn, leave Red Hollow behind like so many other forgotten places. He had learned long ago not to linger where he wasn't meant to be. That was when Orion stepped forward. The dog placed himself squarely between Caleb and the door, not aggressively, not anxiously, just deliberately. His body was calm, his breathing even, his eyes locked on the handle. Caleb felt the tightening in his chest return. "You hear something?" he asked quietly. Orion did not look at him. Outside, faint as breath against glass, came the sound of footsteps, slow, measured, circling the building. Caleb didn't move. His breathing slowed, instincts sliding into place like old armor he never fully took off. The footsteps paused. Silence pressed in, thick and expectant. Orion remained still. After a long moment, the sound faded. No retreat, no approach, just gone. Orion relaxed by a fraction, stepping away from the door. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, elbows resting on his knees. He had survived by listening, to patterns, to silence, to the spaces where something should have been, but wasn't. He looked at Orion, at the quiet intelligence in those watchful eyes. Some places didn't let go easily. Some stays weren't accidents. Caleb lay back, fully clothed, one hand resting lightly against Orion's shoulder, as the town outside settled into uneasy sleep. Against every instinct that had kept him alive before, he closed his eyes and stayed. Caleb woke before dawn, not because of a sound, but because of the absence of one. The room was too still. No wind against the window, no distant engine on the road. Even the forest beyond the town seemed to be holding its breath. Orion was already awake. The German shepherd sat upright beside the door, body tall and steady, ears angled forward with precise attention. His eyes were fixed on the narrow strip of light beneath the doorframe, as if expecting it to move. He hadn't slept at all, or if he had, it had been the kind of sleep that never truly lets go of the world. Caleb swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, joints stiff but obedient. He ran a hand through his short-cropped hair, fingers brushing the faint silver at his temples, and exhaled slowly. The night had passed without incident, yet the tension from before had not fully released its grip. Some dangers didn't announce themselves with violence. Some simply waited. Downstairs, the town was waking reluctantly. The diner lights were on, but only just. A few locals moved along the street with heads down, shoulders hunched, as if bracing against a weather that wasn't there. Caleb noticed how none of them lingered near the forest's edge, how every step stayed close to the center of the road. The woman from the diner, her name, he learned, was Margaret Hale, handed him a mug of coffee without asking. Up close, she was taller than she had looked the night before, her frame narrow but strong, skin pale with a network of fine lines around her eyes that suggested long years of vigilance rather than age alone. Her dark hair remained tightly bound, not a strand out of place. There was something guarded in the way she moved, like someone who had learned that small habits could be the difference between safety and regret. "You planning on fixing your truck today?" she asked, her tone neutral, her eyes flicking briefly toward Orion before returning to the counter. "That's the idea," Caleb replied. Margaret hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Might take longer than you think." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The room Caleb rented sat above the diner, part of an older boarding house that creaked softly with every shift of weight. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and pine cleaner. The walls were lined with faded photographs, town gatherings, old harvest festivals, faces long gone. Caleb noticed that in every photograph taken at night, the background was always unnaturally dark, as if the edges had been swallowed whole. The owner of the building lived at the end of the hall. Her name was Eleanor Price, a woman well into her 70s with sharp cheekbones and steel gray hair pulled into a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. She was short and thin, her posture slightly bent, but her eyes were clear and alert, missing nothing. She wore a thick wool sweater despite the mild temperature, sleeves pulled over her hands as if for comfort. "You slept," she said when Caleb passed, her voice soft but certain. "Yes." She nodded, satisfied. "Then you listened." Eleanor opened the door to her room just wide enough to speak, never fully exposing the interior. Her gaze moved deliberately from Caleb to Orion, lingering there. "There are things you should know if you're staying another night," she said. "Not rules, just ways to keep from making mistakes other people don't get to apologize for." Caleb waited. "Don't open the window after midnight," Eleanor continued. "If you hear someone call your name, don't answer. Doesn't matter if it sounds like someone you love. And if your dog won't move forward, don't force him." Her eyes hardened slightly. "Animals notice things we trained ourselves to ignore." She closed the door gently, conversation finished. Caleb stood in the hallway for a long moment. None of what she said sounded logical. None of it fit neatly into the world he trusted. And yet, none of it felt random. Back in the room, Orion refused to lie down. He paced once, then stopped in front of the mirror mounted above the dresser. His body went rigid. His reflection stared back, dark eyes locked onto their own image. A low, controlled whine escaped his throat, not fear, not aggression, but warning. Caleb stepped closer and saw nothing unusual, just himself, broad-shouldered and tired, and a dog whose instincts were firing at something he could not see. "Easy," Caleb murmured, though he didn't fully believe the word. The memory came unbidden. A desert road, heat shimmering, a patrol moving too quickly, too confident. The dog, another shepherd, younger, less disciplined, had stopped cold, refused to advance. The handler had hesitated, then listened. The explosion came seconds later, tearing the front of the convoy apart. That hesitation had saved lives. Caleb sat heavily on the bed, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely together. He had spent years learning to trust patterns, intelligence, command structures. Belief had never factored into survival, only evidence. And yet, Orion turned away from the mirror and came to him, placing his head beneath Caleb's hand without asking. The weight of it was grounding, real. "If I don't trust you," Caleb said quietly, "who do I trust?" The question hung unanswered. The morning passed slowly. The trucks stubbornly refused to cooperate, the fuel line clogged in the way that suggested time rather than coincidence. By afternoon, clouds had begun to gather, thick and low, dimming the town beneath a muted gray light. It was then that Caleb noticed something else. Every time he approached the edge of the street that led toward the forest, Orion slowed. Not stopped, just enough to signal resistance. A subtle tension through the leash, a shift in weight that asked for attention. When Caleb adjusted course, the tension eased. Midway through the afternoon, as the sky darkened further, Orion froze. They stood near the old rail line, rusted tracks half buried beneath weeds. Caleb felt it again, that tightening behind the ribs. Orion's ears were forward, his eyes fixed on the far end of the line where the tracks disappeared into shadow. From the trees came a sound, not a voice, not quite, something between breath and intention. Caleb waited. He did not answer. He did not move. The sound faded, retreating as if denied something it expected. Orion relaxed, just slightly. Caleb exhaled. That night, as he returned to the room above the diner, he didn't open the window. He ignored the way the air seemed to press inward, thick and expectant, when a voice, too soft, too familiar, whispered his name from somewhere beyond the wall. He remained silent. Orion lay at the foot of the bed, eyes open, watchful. Caleb did not sleep easily. But he slept, and for the first time in years, he did so without a weapon in reach. Caleb noticed the boy near the old wooden bridge because Orion noticed him first. And Orion almost never noticed people unless there was a reason. The bridge marked the outer seam of Red Hollow, where the paved road thinned into dirt and the town loosened its grip on structure. Its planks were worn smooth by years of use, the railings bowed outward as if shaped by waiting rather than weight. Beneath it, a narrow creek slid along quietly, carrying leaves and pale twigs that looked like bones when the light hit them just right. The boy sat on the railing with his legs dangling over the water, utterly still. He looked about 11, small for his age, and thin in the way children got when they learned to live more inside their thoughts than their bodies. His hair was light brown, cut unevenly as if done at home, falling into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. His skin was pale, freckled across the nose and cheeks, and his hands were hidden inside the sleeves of an oversized gray hoodie, despite the mild afternoon. Old sneakers, scuffed nearly white at the toes, rested lightly against the wood. Orion slowed, posture tightening just enough for Caleb to feel it through the leash. The dog's ears rose, angled forward with intent, his gaze fixed on the boy. There was no threat in his stance, no stiffness or growl, only awareness. Caleb adjusted his stride without thinking. Years of working alongside dogs had taught him when to lead and when to follow. The boy looked up. His eyes were calm, not wary the way most children were with strangers, and not careless either. He studied Caleb with quiet focus, then shifted his gaze to Orion. Something softened in his expression, a small flicker of recognition. "You don't have to worry," the boy said. "He already knows you." Caleb stopped. That wasn't how conversations usually began. Orion stepped closer to the boy and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Not tense, not guarded, just present. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest, subtle but unmistakable. "What's your name?" Caleb asked. "Lucas Hale," the boy replied easily. "My mom worked at the diner, before." The word stayed unfinished. Caleb didn't ask what it meant. He'd learned that some losses resisted explanation. Lucas watched Orion closely, leaning forward a fraction. "He's not like the others," he said. "The others?" Caleb prompted. "The dogs that bark," Lucas replied. "The ones that make noise because they're scared. He doesn't do that." A brief smile crossed his face. "He listens." Orion lowered his head and sniffed Lucas's hand, slow and deliberate. Lucas didn't pull away or tense. His calm wasn't bravery, it was familiarity. "That's why he's still here," Lucas added. Caleb swallowed. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet settling comfortably between them. Caleb noticed small things, how Lucas kept his feet close enough to the water to feel the cool air without touching it, how his gaze flicked toward the forest every few minutes before returning to Orion, like checking a lock twice. A careful child, a watchful one. "Most kids don't come out here alone," Caleb said. Lucas shrugged. "Grown-ups don't like this place. They say it's unsafe." "And you?" Lucas stared at the creek for a moment, as if listening. "It's honest," he said. "It doesn't pretend." Caleb didn't press. Truth had a way of surfacing when it was ready. After a pause, Lucas spoke again, quieter. "The town is hungry." The words settled heavily in the air. Caleb felt that familiar tightening behind his ribs, the one that came just before things went wrong. "Hungrier than people," Lucas clarified. "Different." Orion shifted, repositioning his body so that he sat half a step between Lucas and the forest, subtle and deliberate. "What do you mean?" Caleb asked. "It wants something to hold on to," Lucas said. "It gets bored when no one listens. That's when it starts calling." "Calling?" Caleb repeated. Lucas nodded. "Kids hear it more. It doesn't always use words. Sometimes it sounds like memories. Sometimes like someone you miss." His eyes flicked up to Caleb, and for the first time there was a trace of fear there, quickly contained. Adults don't like that. They tell us we're imagining things. Caleb thought of Eleanor's warning. If you hear someone call your name, don't answer. "People go missing," Lucas continued, matter of fact. "Usually the ones who don't listen, or the ones who get mad at the rules and try to leave." "And the dogs?" Caleb asked. Lucas's mouth softened. "They know first. They don't argue with what they feel." He glanced at Orion. "That's why the people who ignore their dogs disappear faster." Orion pressed his nose gently against Lucas's knuckles, then did something that made Caleb's breath catch. The dog licked Lucas's hand. Once. Slow. Careful. Orion didn't do that with strangers. Caleb felt the moment settle deep, heavy with meaning he wasn't ready to name. Lucas laughed softly, surprised. "See?" A protective instinct rose in Caleb without permission, sharp and immediate. It wasn't logical or planned. It simply existed. They stayed by the bridge longer than Caleb realized. Lucas spoke in fragments, never explaining more than necessary. Children heard voices adults didn't. The voices sounded kind at first. People disappeared when they tried to prove the rules were nonsense. Caleb listened without interrupting. Orion stayed close, his attention shifting with the wind, then returning to Lucas, as if confirming something. When they walked back toward town, Orion guided them slightly toward the center of the road, instead of the path nearer the trees. Lucas followed without question. Caleb followed because he trusted the dog more than his own uncertainty. At the edge of the diner lot, Lucas stopped. "You're staying," he said, not asking. "For now," Caleb replied. Lucas studied him carefully, eyes searching. Then he nodded. "That's good," he said. "The dog chose you." Lucas turned and walked away without looking back. Orion watched him go, tail giving a single, slow sweep. Caleb stood there, feeling something fundamental settle into place. He hadn't planned to stay, but the town had noticed him, and the child had spoken to him like fate wearing an ordinary voice. And Orion had already decided. The first man disappeared on a Tuesday night, and the town pretended not to notice until it became impossible to ignore. Ethan heard about it the next morning in the diner, not from an announcement or a worried gathering, but from the shape of silence that settled between conversations. Coffee cups were refilled without comment. Orders were taken and delivered with the same mechanical politeness. Yet every time the front door opened, heads lifted just a fraction too fast, eyes flicking toward the windows as if expecting someone to come back in and finish a sentence they had started the night before. The man's name was Walter Green. Ethan learned this from a waitress in her late 40s, a narrow woman with sharp cheekbones and prematurely gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her name tag read Martha, and she moved with the stiff efficiency of someone who had learned not to linger anywhere too long. She mentioned Walter only once, quietly, as she wiped the counter for the third time. "He said he was done with this place," she murmured. "Packed his truck and tried to leave after dark." She didn't add anything else. Ethan didn't ask. By late afternoon, Briggs began to pace. The German Shepherd moved with restless purpose around the small rented room, nails clicking softly against the floorboards, stopping at the door every few minutes, as if listening for something Ethan couldn't hear. Briggs was 6 or 7 years old, his black and tan coat thick and well kept, despite the constant dust of Red Hollow. His body was powerful but controlled, a working dog's build rather than a show animal's. When he stopped moving, his ears remained alert, eyes tracking shadows that didn't seem to belong to the room. That night, Ethan followed Briggs outside without thinking about why. The air had gone strangely still, heavier than it should have been, carrying no wind despite the open stretch of land beyond the town. Ethan walked with the same measured caution he'd learned years ago, his body remembering patterns his mind didn't consciously summon. Briggs moved ahead, leash slack, nose low to the ground. They found the footprints just past the edge of town. Boot prints, fresh, heavy, leading away from Red Hollow toward the old service road that cut through the trees. Ethan crouched, studying them closely. The stride length was steady, purposeful. No sign of a struggle, no hesitation, just a man walking away. What unsettled him was what wasn't there. No return prints, no overlapping steps, no evidence that Walter had stopped, turned, or even slowed. "It's like he walked into the ground," Ethan muttered. Briggs whined softly, tail stiffening. The dog followed the trail deeper into the trees, pulling slightly now, urgency creeping into his movements. Ethan let him lead. They moved for nearly half a mile before the scent changed, Briggs slowing abruptly, body tensing. The dog stopped near the rusted outline of abandoned railroad tracks, half buried under dirt and weeds. The ground beneath the tracks was warm. Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots. A subtle heat that didn't belong to night soil. He knelt and pressed his palm against the earth. Warm, almost alive. Briggs backed away a step, hackles rising. A low vibration hummed beneath the silence. Not a sound so much as a pressure, like standing too close to something that wasn't meant to be touched. Ethan straightened slowly. This wasn't a curse. He'd seen cursed places before, fear-soaked buildings, ritual scars, violence burned into walls. Red Hollow didn't feel like that. It felt contained. Like a door that had been locked for so long, the hinges had grown teeth. Briggs growled, not at the tracks, but at the darkness beyond them. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and felt his stomach tighten. The forest seemed closer here, trees leaning inward as if listening. The warmth beneath the tracks pulsed faintly, once like a breath. Ethan stepped back. They returned to town without speaking. The next day, a second person tried to leave. This time, Ethan saw it happen. A woman in her early 30s, tall and thin, with sunburned skin and long blonde hair tied into a loose braid, loaded the back of her car near the motel. Her name was Sarah Whitlock, and she carried herself with brittle determination, jaw set too tight, hands shaking as she slammed the trunk shut. Briggs stopped dead in the middle of the street. No amount of coaxing would move him forward. Sarah noticed and laughed nervously. Guess he doesn't like goodbyes. Ethan didn't smile. You shouldn't go, he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. Sarah's eyes flashed. You don't know anything about me. I know enough, Ethan replied. If your dog, or mine, won't move, there's a reason. I'm not staying, she snapped. This town eats people alive. Briggs barked once, sharp and urgent. Sarah froze. The sound wasn't aggressive, it was warning. She hesitated, just for a second too long, then shook her head and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life. Briggs lunged forward, straining against the leash, teeth bared, not at Sarah, but at the road ahead of her. Ethan watched the car disappear into the trees. It never came back. They found her car the next morning, parked just past the railroad tracks, engine cold, door open. No blood. No signs of violence. Only footprints leading away, and none returning. That night, Briggs refused to sleep. He paced the room, stopping often at the window, staring into the dark with focused intensity. At exactly midnight, he let out a low, steady whine and moved to the door, sitting squarely in front of it, blocking the exit. Ethan felt the realization settle with brutal clarity. Red Hollow wasn't hunting people. It was holding something in. The rules the townspeople whispered about weren't about personal survival. They weren't superstition or tradition. They were containment protocols. And people who tried to leave at the wrong time weren't escaping. They were opening the door. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, resting his hand on Briggs' broad neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. For the first time since arriving in Red Hollow, he didn't think about how to get out. He thought about how to keep something else from getting free. Ethan had never planned to leave Red Hollow with anyone, least of all a child. Yet that was how the morning unfolded, quietly, without ceremony. Lucas standing beside the old station wagon at the edge of town, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, eyes fixed on the road as if he were memorizing it for later. The sky hung pale and washed out, the kind of colorless morning that felt unfinished. Birds were absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Lucas looked small next to the car, 11 years old, thin shoulders hunched, hair falling into his eyes again no matter how often he brushed it back. There was a tightness in his posture that hadn't been there by the bridge, a careful readiness that came from knowing departure was never simple. My aunt says we can stay with her sister, Lucas said. His voice was steady, but Ethan heard the strain beneath it. It's 2 towns over, past the tracks. Ethan nodded once. He didn't trust himself to say more. He'd agreed because it seemed like the right thing, because Lucas deserved a chance to leave before Red Hollow decided to take something else from him. Because if the town truly was a hinge between realities, children shouldn't be standing in its doorway. Briggs stood a few feet away, body rigid. The German Shepherd was 6 or 7, large and balanced, his black and tan coat catching the pale light. His ears were upright, angled forward with absolute focus, eyes locked on the front of the car. His tail was low and still, not relaxed, not aggressive, waiting. "Come on, boy," Ethan said gently, opening the back door. Briggs didn't move. Ethan tried again, patting the seat. Briggs stepped forward, and then stopped, planting himself squarely in front of the hood. Lucas froze. Briggs stood broad-chested and unyielding, a living barrier. His gaze flicked once to Ethan, then back to the road, jaw set. A low sound vibrated in his chest, not a growl but something deeper, more resolute. Ethan felt the decision pressing in on him, heavy and unwelcome. He crouched, meeting Briggs's eyes. "We're just driving him out," he said quietly. "That's all." Briggs didn't blink. The ground beneath Ethan's boots felt subtly warm. Lucas took a small step back. "He's choosing," the boy said. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. When he opened them, the warmth had intensified, a faint pulse beneath the pavement, like a distant heartbeat. The air shimmered, barely perceptible, and then the sound came, a low, reverberating pressure that made his teeth ache. Briggs barked once, sharp and commanding, and turned away from the car. He started walking toward the center of town. The first scream echoed just as the sun slipped behind the clouds. It wasn't human, not entirely. It came from everywhere at once, folding through alleys and streets, bouncing off buildings that suddenly felt too close together. Windows rattled. A dog somewhere answered with a panicked howl. Ethan grabbed Lucas's arm. "Inside, now." They ran. The town center opened like a bowl, the old square ringed by buildings that hadn't been renovated in decades. Paint peeled, signs hung crooked. The ground there was bare stone, cracked and worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Briggs stopped in the exact middle of it and sat. The stone beneath him glowed faintly. Ethan felt it then, the pressure he'd been sensing since the tracks, the weight of something enormous pressing upward from below. The air thickened, distorting, and shadows stretched in directions they shouldn't. Shapes moved at the edges of vision. Not bodies, impressions. The suggestion of limbs that couldn't agree on their own angles. Lucas whispered, "It's trying again." The sound rose, turning into a chorus of whispers layered atop one another. Ethan recognized the cadence without recognizing the words. He'd heard it once before, years ago, overseas, just before everything went wrong. The sound of something testing defenses. Briggs rose and placed himself in front of Ethan and Lucas, muscles taut, stance wide. His hackles lifted, but he didn't advance. He held the line. Ethan understood with a clarity that hurt. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were patterns, movements, behaviors designed to keep pressure balanced, to prevent this exact moment. People leaving at night, doors opening at the wrong hour, dogs ignored. The town didn't hunt. It held. A shadow surged upward from the stone, not breaking through but pressing against it, warping the surface like water under ice. Ethan felt the pull then, a tug not at his body, but at his memories. Faces, voices. A name whispered in his mother's voice. He clenched his jaw and looked at Briggs. The dog met his gaze, eyes steady, ancient in their understanding. "You're not my dog," Ethan said quietly. Briggs didn't react. "You're the gate," Ethan continued. "And you need someone to stand with you." The pressure surged again, stronger this time. Lucas cried out as the stone beneath his feet flared with heat. Ethan pulled him close, shielding him with his body. "I can't leave," Ethan said, the words settling into place with a grim calm. "Not yet." Briggs stepped closer, shoulder brushing Ethan's leg, a single, deliberate contact. acceptance. The surge faltered. The shadows recoiled, retreating inch by inch, as if pressed back by an unseen force. The air cooled. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of Ethan's breathing and Lucas's quiet sobs. When it was over, the square was silent. Lucas looked up at Ethan, eyes wide and wet. "It chose you too," he said. Ethan stared down at the stone, now cold and inert. "No," he replied. "I chose it." Briggs sat at his side, calm once more. A sentinel returned to rest. Ethan knew then what staying meant. Not heroism, not victory, just vigilance, presence, the willingness to stand where the world thinned and not look away. Red Hollow didn't need saving, it needed guarding. And Briggs, steady, silent Briggs, had never belonged to him. He had been waiting. Red Hollow went quiet, the way a battlefield did just before the first mistake. Not peaceful, not calm, just emptied. The insects stopped. The wind fell away. Even the old houses seemed to hold their breath, their wooden frames no longer creaking as they settled. Ethan noticed the absence before he registered anything else, because absence had always been the most dangerous signal. In his experience, silence didn't mean safety. It meant something was listening. Briggs rose from his spot near the door without a sound. The German shepherd moved with deliberate control, muscles shifting under his thick black and tan coat, posture changing from rest to readiness in a single breath. At 6 or 7 years old, Briggs no longer wasted energy. His ears angled forward, tail low and still, eyes fixed on the hallway leading deeper into the rented house. He didn't growl. He never did when the threat wasn't meant to be chased away. The first voice came softly. "Ethan?" It carried familiarity like a weapon. The tone was exact, shaped by memory rather than sound, sliding into his head instead of his ears. It sounded like his mother, tired but patient, calling him in from the yard when the light began to fade. Ethan didn't answer. He sat on the edge of the bed, spine straight, feet planted flat on the floor. Discipline surfaced automatically, drilled into him long before Red Hollow ever existed in his life. Control breathing, count time, observe without engagement. He rested one hand lightly on his thigh, the other hovering close to Briggs's shoulder without touching him. The voice returned. "Ethan, open the door." The handle turned, slowly. The door creaked inward on its own, revealing darkness that didn't behave like shadow. It folded inward, dense and layered, as if the space beyond it were deeper than the house should allow. Cold air spilled across the floor, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and something older, something buried. Briggs stepped forward half a pace, always half a step ahead. A shape gathered in the doorway, assembling itself with reluctant precision. It wore the outline of a man Ethan had once trusted, broad shoulders, squared jaw, familiar stance. But the proportions were wrong. The face sagged, features pulled too long, eyes set just slightly too far apart. When it smiled, the expression lacked weight, like skin stretched over something hollow. "You don't have to do this," it said. "You've done enough." Ethan fixed his gaze on the floor just beyond Briggs's paws. "Don't look. Don't answer." Seconds passed, then minutes. Time stretched, elastic and punishing, each heartbeat echoing too loudly in his chest. The thing leaned closer, its presence bending the air, whispering names of places Ethan had bled in, of men he'd buried. Each word was an invitation to step forward, to correct something unfinished. Briggs shifted again, placing himself fully between Ethan and the doorway. The dog's breathing remained steady, a quiet rhythm anchoring the room. Another door opened somewhere in the house. Footsteps followed, soft, deliberate, wrong. Shadows crossed the walls, some tall, some broken, some wearing faces Ethan recognized and wished he didn't. He kept his eyes down. He counted heartbeats. 30, 60, 90. discipline over instinct. A hand brushed the edge of his vision. "Look at me." Ethan closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, light flared. Images pressed in. Lucas alone at the bridge, the diner empty at noon, the warmth beneath the railroad tracks. He felt the pull again, not at his body, but at his sense of time, as if the night wanted him to forget when it began. Briggs barked once, sharp, commanding. The sound cut through the pressure like a blade. The presence recoiled, faltering, as if it had miscalculated something fundamental. The figures retreated a step. Ethan opened his eyes just enough to see Briggs glance back at him, then move down the hallway. The dog didn't look to see if Ethan followed. He assumed it. They moved through the house together, Briggs leading by instinct, Ethan matching pace with restraint. Doors stood open that had been closed, cold pooled in corners where it didn't belong. In the living room, a mirror leaned crooked against the wall. In it, Ethan saw himself standing alone. The reflection smiled. He looked away immediately. The mirror cracked, a thin fracture spidering across the glass. Outside, the town stirred. Streetlights flickered. Somewhere nearby, glass shattered. The whispers rose again, overlapping, pleading, angry. A figure stepped into the road as they exited the house, a tall woman with long blonde hair in a loose braid, skin stretched pale and tight, eyes hollow. Sarah Whitlock's face twisted, mouth opening too wide. "Help me," it said. Ethan stopped. Every instinct screamed to move forward, to reach out. He locked his knees and stayed where he was. Briggs stepped ahead instead, planting himself directly between Ethan and the thing. The shepherd lowered his head, stance wide, body forming a living boundary. The creature hissed, retreating half a step. Time slowed again. Ethan focused on what he could control. Distance, stillness, breath. This wasn't a fight to win. It was a line to hold. Minutes passed. The pressure tested them again and again, probing for weakness. One by one, the figures lost cohesion, edges blurring, forms collapsing into shadow. Doors creaked shut. The whispers thinned, dissolving into frustration. Briggs didn't move until the night released them. Dawn arrived pale and cautious, light touching rooftops as if afraid to linger. Ethan sank onto the curb, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Briggs sat beside him, shoulder pressed firmly against his leg, solid and real. Ethan stared down the quiet street and understood. This was the hardest battlefield he'd ever known. No gunfire, no enemy to strike, only discipline, time, and the strength to stand still. Dawn came the way mercy sometimes did, slow, pale, almost hesitant, as if even the sun wasn't sure it was welcome in Red Hollow. The sky lightened in thin layers of gray and soft blue, revealing rooftops still standing, windows still intact, streets still quiet. The town looked ordinary again in the daylight, like a place that could be passed through without consequence. But Ethan knew better. He had seen what lived in the hours when the world thinned, when silence wasn't peace, but attention. Red Hollow remained, not because it was safe, but because it was contained. A line drawn in dust and discipline. Ethan sat on the curb outside the rented house, shoulders heavy with exhaustion that went deeper than muscle. He was 40, tall and broad-shouldered, built with the compact strength of a man who had survived by function, not vanity. His olive-green combat shirt clung slightly to his frame, the camouflage sleeves blending into the muted morning. Short dark hair, cut close in the tactical style, showed the first silver at his temples. A disciplined stubble lined his jaw, and his blue-gray eyes held the steady distance of someone who had spent years scanning horizons for danger. He looked calm now, but it was the calm of a soldier after the worst night, when the body is still upright, but the soul has been stretched thin. Briggs sat beside him, solid and real, a German shepherd of 6 or 7 years, with a classic black and tan coat that caught the weak sunlight along his back. He was large, balanced, built for work, not show. His ears remained forward even in rest, his posture never fully careless. Yet there was something different in him now, a quiet completion. He leaned his shoulder against Ethan's leg with the simple weight of loyalty, as if to remind him that standing still could be its own kind of victory. For a long time, neither of them moved. The town around them began to wake cautiously. A door opened down the street. Someone stepped out, glanced toward Ethan, then quickly looked away, as if eye contact might invite questions no one wanted to answer. Red Hollow did not celebrate survival. It merely continued. Footsteps approached on the sidewalk, measured and careful. Ethan lifted his gaze to see Margaret Hale, the diner woman, walking toward them with a mug of coffee in her hands. In the morning light, she looked taller than she had in the dim interior of the diner, her frame lean but strong, her dark hair still pulled into its severe bun. Fine lines circled her eyes, not from age alone, but from years of vigilance. Her mouth was set in the expression of someone who had learned not to hope loudly. She stopped a few feet away, holding out the mug. "You made it through," she said. It wasn't praise, it was acknowledgement, like marking a name off a list. Ethan accepted the coffee, his fingers brushing the warmth as if confirming reality. "So did the town," he replied. Margaret's gaze flicked to Briggs, and for the first time something softened in her face. "The dog always does," she murmured. Ethan almost asked what she meant, but questions felt dangerous here. Words had weight in Red Hollow, and sometimes weight was what pulled things closer. Margaret hesitated, then spoke again, quieter. "The boy, Lucas, he's at my sister's place now, out past Briar County, far enough." Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something like grief dressed as relief. Lucas safe meant the town had not taken him. It meant the child's story might continue somewhere with sunlight and ordinary rules. "Thank you," Ethan said. Margaret nodded once, as if gratitude was a currency she didn't know how to spend. "He didn't fight it," she added. "He said he understood. Said the dog chose right." Ethan stared down at the street, at the cracks in the pavement that looked too normal for what lay beneath them. He thought of Lucas's thin shoulders, the way the boy had spoken about hunger as if naming weather. "I didn't want him involved," Ethan admitted. "No one wants children involved," Margaret replied. Her voice sharpened slightly, and behind it was a lifetime of buried anger. "But the town doesn't ask what we want." She turned to leave, then paused as if something in her resisted walking away without saying the truth aloud. "You're staying," she said. It was not a question. Ethan looked at Briggs. The dog's eyes were steady, ancient in their patience. "I am," Ethan answered. Margaret exhaled, almost like surrender. "Then you'll learn what the rest of us learned. This place doesn't keep heroes, it keeps guardians." She walked back toward the diner, her shoulders straight, carrying her own quiet burden. The morning stretched forward. Ethan returned to the room upstairs only long enough to wash his face, to sit on the edge of the bed and listen to the ordinary sounds of daylight. Birds had returned, cautiously, as if testing the air. Somewhere, a truck engine started. Red Hollow wore normalcy like a mask, and Ethan understood now that masks were part of survival. Around mid-morning, he found Lucas's abandoned hoodie folded neatly on the chair. Margaret must have brought it up after the boy left. Ethan picked it up carefully, the fabric still holding the faint scent of creek water and childhood. Something in his throat tightened. Briggs stepped closer, nose lifting toward the hoodie, then toward Ethan, as if checking him the way he checked doorways. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You did good," he murmured. Briggs's tail moved once, slow and restrained. It was then, somewhere between exhaustion and mourning, that the strange moment arrived, quiet enough that it could have been missed. Briggs walked to the window and sat, staring down at the street below. Ethan followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual at first, just sunlight on pavement, just empty road. Then Briggs lowered his head slightly, ears angling towards something Ethan could not hear. A child's laughter drifted up from far away, faint as memory. Ethan froze. Lucas was gone. The town was quiet. No children played outside. Briggs did not growl. He did not bark. He simply watched, unmoving, as if listening to an echo from the wrong side of the world. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Is that real?" he whispered. Briggs turned his head just enough to look back at him, eyes calm, almost gentle, as if to say, "Do not answer. Do not follow. Not everything that sounds like life belongs to life." The laughter faded. The air returned to stillness, and Ethan understood, with a clarity that settled like stone. Red Hollow would always test the edges. It would always try small cracks, soft voices, familiar sounds. Not every battle came with screams. Some came with sweetness. By afternoon, Ethan walked the town center alone, Briggs beside him, half a step ahead. People watched from windows. Some nodded faintly, not in welcome, but in recognition. Ethan realized they were not judging him. They were relieved. A man in a sheriff's jacket stood outside the general store, older, heavy-set, with a graying beard and tired eyes that had seen too much. His name tag read Deputy Amos Keller. He didn't approach, but he raised 2 fingers in a gesture that was almost respectful. "Hell of a night," Amos called softly. Ethan gave a small nod. "The worst ones always are," he replied. Amos's gaze dropped briefly to Briggs. "That dog yours?" Ethan's mouth twitched, humor dry as dust. "I think I'm his," he said. Amos let out a short breath that might have been a laugh, if laughter still lived easily here. "Then you'll last," he said, and walked away. Evening began to gather again, slow and inevitable. Ethan stood once more at the edge of the town square, staring at the worn stone beneath his boots. He could feel nothing now, no warmth, no pulse, but he knew it was there, waiting for the next thinning of the world. Briggs sat beside him, calm, patient, as if the night were simply another shift. Ethan had not stayed because he was trapped. He stayed because something had chosen him, yes, but more than that, because he had chosen back. There were men whose names were carved into monuments, celebrated for battles won with noise and fire. And then there were others, standing quietly in forgotten towns, holding lines no one knew existed. Briggs rested his head against Ethan's knee, eyes half-lidded, peaceful in a way that felt earned. Red Hollow would not remember Ethan Cole in any history book, but the world beyond it might never know how close it came to breaking. Some guardians were never named, and some dogs saved the world simply by standing still. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive as light in the sky or voices from above. Sometimes they arrive as quiet warnings we almost ignore. A feeling that tells us to slow down, a moment of stillness that asks us to listen, a loyal presence that steps in front of danger when we don't yet see it. Faith doesn't always look like certainty. Often, it looks like obedience without explanation. In our daily lives, we face moments like that more often than we realize. A choice to stay when running feels easier. A choice to protect when walking away would hurt less. A choice to trust something deeper than fear, even when the world feels uncertain. Maybe that's how God works most of the time. Not through thunder, but through guidance. Not through force, but through love placed quietly in our path. If this story reminded you to listen more closely, to trust the good that guards you, or to stand still when everything urges you to flee, then it has already done its work. Please share this story with someone who might need it tonight. Leave a comment with your thoughts or experiences. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories about loyalty, courage, and the unseen grace that walks beside us. May God watch over you, protect your steps, and grant peace to your heart. Wherever you are and whatever you are facing, you are not alone.